Hello, and welcome to this Rain Taxi virtual event featuring Will Alexander in conversation with D.S. Marriott. I'm Eric Lorber, the director of Rain Taxi. If you don't yet know about us, we are a nonprofit organization that champions aesthetically adventurous literature through a quarterly print magazine of critical writing, as well as through a robust online presence. Please visit us at raintaxi.org to learn more. Whether you're an occasional visitor or you'd like to become a member, we'd love to have you along for the ride. To do everything we do, Rain Taxi receives partial funding from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Minnesota State Arts Board, among other places. Their support helps keep most of our events, like this one, free to attend. But our most vital support actually comes from individual readers. So if you're able to pitch in a little something, please feel free to hit that donate button on your screen and know that even a small gift makes a big difference. We're also having our annual Give to the Max campaign. Give to the Max Day is tomorrow here in Minnesota. So any gift you give through that link, we'll try to put it up on the chat, gives us a matching grant. And that's really an incredible way to help us out as well. Lots of things you can do in the audience to participate on screen tonight. You can chime in on the chat, of course, keep comments and observations coming there. If you have a question for the authors, put that in the Ask a Question box, and we'll get to those at the end of the event. And of course, you can buy the book. Don't forget, when you purchase a book at a literary event, you are supporting not only the author and their publisher, but the event host and a great independent bookstore based in an actual community on planet Earth. Tonight, that's our friends at Majors and Quinn Booksellers in Minneapolis. It's now my pleasure to introduce our guests. Will Alexander, one of our longtime heroes. We have reviewed his work since almost our first or second year of publication. We can't review it all. He's so prolific, but we've dipped in and out of many of the books that have come out over the past two and a half decades. And it's been a thrill just to see his language universe expand as universes do. His new book, it's so new I don't even have a copy myself yet, but I can't wait to get it, is called Divine Blue Light for John Coltrane, and it is out in the legendary City Lights Pocket Poet series. Will, in fact, is currently in the office of Lawrence Ferlinghetti at City Lights Bookstore, an amazing and storied place. In one of our reviews about a book by Will, the reviewer said that his book is an incredible manifestation of speech. And that phrase has always kind of stuck with me. I think it really speaks to the velocity of Will's work. And so to talk with him tonight, we needed someone who could keep up with that manifestation of speech. And I think we found him. David Marriott is a stellar poet and scholar himself, many books in both genres that have been adding to the field. Latest book of poetry, also published by City Lights, Before Whiteness. And I highly recommend this as well. If you do hit the buy the book button to get Will's book, you can always buy more books there too. Just enter it in the search field and get what you want, because what could be better than getting one book of poetry from City Lights than getting two? So that's a tip for you all tonight. I'm going to turn it over to these fine gentlemen. I'm just so thrilled they're both here and can't wait to hear this conversation. At home, please express some joy and welcome Will Alexander in conversation with David Marriott.
Great to talk to you again, David. Always.
Yeah, and you too, Will. Thanks to Eric and thanks to Kelly and thanks to everybody at Rain Taxi for making this possible. And it's an honor to be sharing this event with you and launching your great new book, which I'm lucky to have a copy of. So I'm just going to be, I don't know if we could begin by just asking a couple of introductory questions about the book and perhaps move out to more general conversation, if that's okay with you, Will.
Sure.
So The Divine Blue Light is a book dedicated or written for John Coltrane.
It was.
Could you say more about your relationship to John Coltrane, his music?
It was something that is organically sprung, as I said last evening at City Lights, like a seed growing up from the earth. And I discovered many years ago Coltrane's music on radio at, I was maybe 12, 13 years old, 14 years old. And it's continued to grow as many others. I'm not special in that regard, but it just seemed to take a certain kind of a hold in me that was very internal. And so it has allowed me to be where I'm at today. I don't want to say that literally, but it has been the energy that has provoked my lingual fields.
Yeah. In the poem to Coltrane at the center of the book, you talk about, you refer to him as sonic universe, or the sonic power of Coltrane. He talks about the ways in which he produces bricolage, grammars that incite arousal. And when you talk about it's a ferment that embrangles grace with all its improbable complexity. And then you say, which is also another line which really stuck with me when I was reading the poem, it's like you say, you come back to this notion of entanglement, and you says that it's set afloat within the wisdom of its own entanglement. Now, when I was reading those lines, I was reminded of something I think you said elsewhere, maybe in another interview, that poetry by its very nature escapes delimitation. I was wondering what you meant by that, if you could say more about that.
Well, it has a certain kind of a liberation that transpires within the language. It tends to, at least for me, it begins to lift weight off of the quotidian experiment and begin to infuse other ethers and other energies that are less tangible, but nevertheless powerful. And it doesn't have as much weight on time or limitations of time, or the weight of time, or the weight of matter. Well, language is non-matter. It's a better way of putting it. Language as non-matter. So this is the way that one begins to waft, and one frees oneself from any rules or restrictions, or any kind of, in other words, it's a form of weightlessness.
And is that how you would, I mean, that resonates with me as a way of describing the way Coltrane's music takes flight, almost mid-solo?
Well, it's similar, I guess, for him because of the fact that that's a universal kind of reality. That at that space of mind, that level of mind, energy begins to take on a universal continuum. It takes on a universal constant in the universe itself.
And when you're writing these lines, are you talking about that energy as part of the language process you kind of immerse yourself in?
Yeah, I immerse myself in the language to such a degree that it's not like entering a door, but it's just like emerging into that field of interaction. And the words just almost come, they do come to me. And I don't prepare for anything. I just begin to write.
So the words like dictate it to you, or dictate themselves to you?
The latter. It's like entering a field. And once you enter that field, the other is the old biblical verse says, man's extremity is God's opportunity. So you're in that land of opportunity, that perpetual opportunity. And so one writes until one finishes that level of opportunity and goes to the other level of opportunity.
Right. So that makes a lot of sense to me reading your poetry, because I don't know whether people out there are used to your poetry, but the kind of phrasing of it, you don't get discrete phrases. The phrases tumble into each other and expand without ending. The ending and beginning of phrases is kind of like, again, this notion of embranglement or entanglement. But what you were just saying there about the energy, both being corporeal and incorporeal, you're very much a poet who's concerned with both the spirit and the letter. You don't separate the two; they're both combined. Has that always been a part of your practice?
That's been part of my nature.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, it's Philip Lamantia once says that you're born a poet. You're not made a poet.
Yeah.
So it's that kind of feel for me, that you're born from a poet spirit, poetic spirit from your mother, and this is how things happen. You know,
Yeah, right.
the world.
There's no substitute for that. You're either born with it or not. So this question I have for you is about the first poem in the book. Again, just more introductory as a way of placing it for the potential readers of the book. So the first poem is called Condoned to Disappearance, and it's dedicated for Fernando Pessoa.
Mm-hmm.
So whether you could talk us through how you came to write this poem and why Pessoa.
Well, I knew about Pessoa via actually an introduction written by Octavio Paz. Said that Pessoa was the type of poet that would almost disappear in midair. And it intrigued me. And I began to read his work and began to know something about his biography.
Yeah.
And I understood his very nature, that very nature of poetry, how it summons you through all these cataracts of defamation that transpire across your life. You know, from like in Pessoa's case, his aunts and the people he roomed with, and the local quotidian, literary people. And he was able to find his way through what we have come to know as the pre-war, as a pre-war terminology. That was able, the poet, in other words, he was sustained by poetry. And I didn't ever think of that as being some kind of utopian anachronism, but a utopian kind of presence in the work. And in his biography, the utopian presence. I know there's a biography on him, but I was able to get through this area by me somehow getting together with Richard Zenith. I did an interview or talk with Richard Zenith some years ago in here in California, in Venice, and Beyond Baroque. And I was ultimately fed into my appearance in Lisbon and going to Pessoa's original house. It was a magical experience for me. So, you know, it kind of condoned, in other words, it condoned, I said condoned the disappearance. It condoned my appearance according to his disappearance, if that could be, that's not too awkwardly stated. But I was able to go to Pessoa's house and see the simulation of the trunk with all the pieces of paper. And that reminded me of myself scribbling notes on envelopes and he had so many envelopes and so many scraps of paper that you're still deciphering that work. And it's so much. He's always working. That's the one thing I have kinship with him. I'm always working. Not in a literary sense, but just because of the need to write poetry. Yeah.
I mean, he used a lot of various authorships to write in different styles. And,
the heteronyms, they're amazing.
Yeah.
And they haven't really gone through all of them, but it's astrologers and actual other types of poets, pastoral poets, adventurers, you name it. But it's the liberty of the art, including himself. He was one of the protagonists, but not always, because his imagination would soar to such a degree that he could intensify each scope of poetic enumeration.
So are you attracted to this idea of the heteronym versus what you call in the poem the ideological self?
No, not personally, no, but I'm attracted to the scent of that idea, that scent of that praxis.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like that.
But the idea of disappearance, is that an idea about the writer who disappears from their work, or just disappears in kind of general? Could you say more about that?
Oh yeah, well, as a poet, you tend to disappear. At least I do.
Yeah.
I appear and disappear, and it's like, I think Carl Jung said it, a mystic goes through a certain kind of a level of appearance and disappearance throughout his living day.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a non-quotidian lifestyle.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So you can't be tracked in a linear condoning, if I can put it that way.
Yeah, so the linear condoning, I think, is something which you're very much opposed to. This idea of delimitation, prescription. You say, I mean, like in other places you refer to, you're refusing a prescribed template for how you write or what you should write about, and your language, your very use of language, is a kind of refusal of that kind of prescription.
Yeah, it's a non-quotidian dictate. Non-quotidian dictate.
So sorry, Karen, I didn't mean to interrupt. Yeah.
No. You go ahead.
No, I mean, you've spoken about being railroaded into various categories and how that is kind of psychic death for you. And I'm interested in how you get over that, or how you respond to those kinds of prescriptions, given that that's how reality seems to be.
Yeah, and that's how reality seems to work.
Yeah.
Well, I'm like, I always say, I'm like, in this sense, Bud Powell. You can not. It's the only thing I can do is play the piano. In his case, or in my case, just writing all the time. To get out of that. Okay.
So when I think about your poetry, and we began by talking about the kind of universal aspirations of the poetry.
Mm-hmm.
I do think it's a progressive universal poetry, and by universal I mean that sense of Aimé Césaire, the poet, talked about this universal being written from the point of view of the indigenous.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a word which I know you've used in your poetry, but it's like a poetry which is enriched or deepened by what you call the indigenous. And I was wondering, again, how that's played itself out throughout your work, up into including Divine Blue Light.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's like a vein in a mine.
Mm.
It never goes empty. It always produces gold.
Mm.
It's not it's always renewing itself. Poetry continues to renew itself.
Mm-hmm.
You're always hearing differently all the time. If you're creative, and that's how your ear works, that's how your mind and ear connect, then you're in this infinite motion.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the way that stars promulgate throughout the universe.
Mm-hmm.
They don't promulgate as the sun that we know, but they promulgate in different forms across different expanses that are absolutely endless.
Mm-hmm.
It's all this theoretical talk of notion about the end of the universe. It doesn't seem to be any.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always giving us new flares and new instances of itself via other differing solar dominations.
Right. Okay. So, if I were to try and kind of relate that to how you're working poetically, in terms of when I read your poetry, I'm conscious of the fact that these kind of explosions, perpetual explosions, are occurring at the level of the line itself. So when I read your poetry, it's very much a kind of, the lines are constantly falling into one another and then being kind of readdressed in the line following. I mean, it's a classic paratactic almost principle, whereby when I continue reading, I have to revise what I've just read. There's no ground which allows you to set. You have to keep on moving through the poem, and that's what I think of as what you're referring to as a kind of nexus of energy in this book. And I was wondering, again, is that I don't really see that happening that much in contemporary American poetry, especially in the way in which you use that kind of lexical experimentational density. I see it happening in other poets, like Aimé Césaire. Is a big influence on you, I know, but I'm just wondering where would you place that kind of experimentation in terms of your own evolution as a poet?
Well, I was so influenced by the example of emphasis there and the circular breathing of Sonny Rollins.
Right.
And then continuous motion that was always taking place, or the way that swift birds in nature kind of migrate in a way that allows them to resuscitate themselves even during flight.
Mm-hmm.
So this is something, a notion I've taken as a natural, not a scholarly understanding, but as a natural understanding.
Sure.
My language was adaptable to that understanding.
That's yeah. So you're resuscitating yourself in flight. That's a great way of putting it. Yeah. So it's like a meta rotation, but it's constant.
It is meta. Yeah. So it's not something that you prescribe, and you, by the way, you don't know when this is going to happen. It's not something you can plot. It's not a George Sand template where you sit at a desk for 20 hours at a stretch and write a little bit or write none, and you produce a book that way.
Right.
Not a prescription, but you don't, like surrealism, you don't have a prescription. You just move. You just ignite.
Yeah.
And this is not ideological for me, but it's a natural constant.
Yeah. So that pursuit of the marvelous, you have to do it in whichever way makes it happen.
Of course.
You can't. What you need to guard against is turning those techniques into fetishes or into things which make things static all over again. Right.
I never that's a great point. I was talking to Garrett, we were talking a little earlier about never repeating yourself.
Yeah.
Always renewing yourself. Something I did learn later from Julio Cortázar. It says, I never want to take advantage of myself by doing the same poem over and over again, because I found the groove, and it sets up a baseline of repetition that loses its sheen over time.
Yeah. So two of the words I'm just going to arbitrarily choose as a way of talking about shifting the register a bit. There's a kind of tension, if you like, in the book between this word osmosis, which is used a lot, and this word utopia. And again, the osmotic, if that's the right way of saying it, becomes this turning point or this hinge point whereby things always coalesce or get transferred into something else. And this would echo with what you're calling this meta rotation. But the way you're doing it is not only at the level of the word, but at the level of syntax and rhythm and harmony and dissonance and all the rest of it. So it's a full package. I mean, this poetry is a kind of very ambitious poetry. I think of it as an attempt to think totality almost.
It's an interesting way of putting it. Yeah, it's a form of totality.
Yeah.
I've always aspired to the totality of reality, and this is my only way of absorbing that totality and begin to making it meaningful, not in a rational way, but in a full and wholesome, and I mean that in a whole sense, not in a wholesome sense, but a whole sense.
Yes.
Begins to absorb those wholenesses of the universe.
Yes.
It's a way of getting into the universe that has given us its own presence. So we're just feeding back into that kind of, I'd say that organic miracle. It's a miracle, but it's also an indigenous reality that one is getting into via the miracle.
Yeah. So, the way to escape kind of hierarchy is to kind of grasp the whole and have one's place in the whole.
Yeah, exactly. So you can partake of the whole.
Yeah.
Lingually partake of the whole.
Yeah.
As one as high as one can go.
Yeah. I mean, that would also explain why each book is a kind of further experimentation or pursuit of the whole and doesn't stay still, as we've already discussed.
You're right about that's a very important point. Is always the motion, not for the sake of just motion, but of change, but of organic motion, organic spillage from one genre to, in my case, one genre to another.
Yeah.
Well, at one point I thought that I felt that upon my discovery of the aphorism and praxis of the aphorism, I could stay at that plane and write at that plane all the time. I said, no, I don't want to do that. And that's when I began to understand that essays were kind of like having a camera and going out into the universe and beginning to shoot whatever I see, which is an essay. I could write on this topic or that topic, or I could do that via playwriting, which I never thought I would able to do, but it just morphed into that.
Yeah, no, it makes absolute sense, because if you're thinking about totality, you can't restrict yourself to questions of genre, or indeed, bits of knowledge. You have to go for the whole thing. I mean, that's why I admire the poetry, and that's why I think it's kind of major poetry, because it has the same ambition, epical ambition, I would say, which is rare. It's very rare. I mean, especially in today, where you either have lyricism as the main genre, or you have kind of long poems. But the long poem, which is composed of fragments, is not poetry of totality.
No, it's not. Because for me, the totality is so enriched. I feel that, a small poem that I've done in Divine Blue Light is just as absorbing for me as this long work I've done. My longest work, the Combustion Cycle, which is over 600 pages. So it's the same experience. I'm not just trying to write a long book or a particular kind of book or short book, but it dictates its own manner, its own wavelength.
Yeah. Well, on that note, shall we get you to read one of the new poems?
I'll read a little bit. Yeah, I won't read all of the work, but I'll take a little section from Condone the Disappearance. We talked about that, and I'll read a page or two, and we'll go for that. And then I'll skip to other works, but we'll talk about them as we go.
Yeah.
And Condone the Disappearance, it's for Fernando Pessoa. As sigil, camouflaged by curious smoke and surcease, there remains your visage, enigmatic and crystal, remaining hidden within occulted lingual ravines. At one level, it is known that your appellation is Fernando Pessoa, born 13 June 1888. Of course, there exists the perfunctory tables of your chronicle. Loss of your natural father at 5, your mother's remarriage and new placement in Durban, then university stay, fueled by magnetic indifference, then life in rented rooms, then business letters translated from Portuguese to English and French, then criticism written in 1912, creative prose in 1913, and the following year, poetry, the heteronyms, their powers, their conspicuous agendas, including Alberto Cairo, Ricardo Reis, Alvaro de Campos, then one brief romance, the limited publication, then death by cirrhosis of the liver, a capsule, an unleavened symmetry, a migratory transit, events from my written realm as co-sensation. And why do I emphasize the migratory? It is because you've always assumed kinetics that reveal ghosts emerging and re-emerging from Lisbon. Fernando being purity, figurative insularity, roaming a perch of invisible significance, retreating to an emblematic edge only to return as visual briefings, to omit perfection by scent, by confounding observation, lit from within by inner magnificence, your inner eye, a refracted body of diamonds that formed as an inner cyclonics, as true and concussive blood form.
Yes, that's wonderful. Especially your inner eye. refractory body of diamonds that really jumped out at me. Okay, so yeah, so you can see in that passage you read there how the kind of biography is being folded in, but it's been taken somewhere else. I mean, in terms of these symmetries and these migrations and these invisible significances you talk about.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And yeah, carry on, please. Yeah.
Yeah, we won't. I never kind of work with it as a concentration, but it's a distribution of energy.
Yeah.
So it gets a spectrum of energy fields that amplify the presence of Pessoa.
Yeah. Well, what I like about the poem is how that energy is modulated across various lengths of line, as well as the you and the I is that kind of interesting dialectic. But also, I just love the way you go in and out of his own poetry, and then go somewhere completely different. I mean, it's a long poem. It's a long poem, but it really is a major note to it. It's not written in a minor key. It's written in kind of a loud major key. It's not elegiac but it's a kind of, I don't know, very affirmative song to Pessoa's work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's a great way of assessing the poem, because I figured one can begin to take a long poem like this as a nugget, not as a spectrum where we have to read for 20 minutes and just not bore people, but exhaust people.
Yeah.
Because this kind of poetry can exhaust other individuals, listeners, and I try to work with that and understand that. In a reading, it has a compact space, but the compact space should be sufficient, like synecdoche, the part for the whole. So that principle I'm going to work with today, the part for the whole.
Right. Okay. So, I mean, that again reminds me of what we've been talking about. So there's, we talked about the aspirations of the poem to kind of include various vibrations, articulations, energies, which are not just constricted or delimited, but open, are meant to open things out and keep things moving. That meta rotation we talked about. So there must be things which are negative to that, which have things which you're writing against. And in earlier books, such as Asian Haiti, for example, I think there's several examples of what you're calling in here, say necrology, the torturous estrangements, and what you call the tragic sense of danger, which again I think is being written from an indigenous or Black point of view in terms of the dangers that threaten those kinds of that expansiveness which we've already been talking about. And it's that yours is not a social realist kind of poetry, but it's clear to me that the targets are those kinds of police ontologies, if you like, which seek to restrict, constrain not only art but indigenous Black art as well.
Yeah, that's an incredible point, because this is something I've always not fought against, but I'm not that.
Yeah.
Yet I'm part of the indigenous.
Yeah.
And I'm part of that whole spectrum of life. But I'm not like the early poet Jupiter Hammond, early Black poet who went almost nuts because he was enslaved. Or situations like Phyllis Wheatley. It just seems like we've stopped at that point. The greater imperial mentality wanted to stop at being in the ghetto or being in a St. Louis housing project. I could have easily done that because I grew up approximate to Watts. I was actually in the street that had the first eruption of the first Los Angeles insurrection as a child. That was the Watts situation. And my goodness, man, it's not one. I don't want to just stop there and repeat yourself and just win prizes.
Right.
For that kind of stoppage.
Right.
To continue to go where the strain is leading us. It's leading us into another reality that the indigenous people really procured outside of this situation, say in Jamaica or China. It's taking that substrate and to flow with it.
Yeah.
So I can go on and on about that, but we want to continue to talk.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm perfectly willing to hear what you're saying about this, but the idea is that, you know, there's to escape that kind of imprisoning, you need to do more than just represent yourself. You need to avoid kind of forms of rhetorical enslavement too.
Yeah, rhetorical repetition.
Yeah, rhetorical repetition. So you need to kind of overcome that, and that's why, you know, there's a line of Césaire which I'm very reminded of when he's talking about, you know, how to move beyond these kinds of imprisonings. He talks about, you know, one needs to also move away from conventional forms of poetry if you're going to, what he says is achieve this descent into self, which he, like negritude is like a descent into the self, and it's a way of going beyond all those stultifying forms which imprison you, your mind, your consciousness, your psyche, your body, and you know, the deeper you go, the freer you become. So it's not like Orpheus going down and trying to retrieve something and then singing. This is like the deeper you go into the darker the depths, the better you sing.
As Gurdjieff says, the thicker the fog, the better the engine runs.
You're right.
This is the truth. I mean, you learn this through practice, not through ideology.
Yeah.
But it seems like the prize makers and the personality builders in the literary establishment want to stop at a certain level and begin to repeat oneself.
Right.
This is one thing I did learn from Coltrane. A lot of fans got upset when the John Coltrane album, John Coltrane Plays with Chim Chim Cheree.
Yeah.
He was starting to break away from strict timekeeping, that or the semblance of timekeeping.
Right.
And the energy began to flow in a certain way that, in other words, the way Alice Coltrane spread sound rather than concentrated sound. And I must admit, in my understanding, I was prone to the concentrations of McCoy Tyner, but I did understand that necessity for growth.
Yes.
For transmutation.
Yes.
And you need to do that. That's the bravery of an artist, not an ideology, but a bravery. That necessity that comes through. Don't take advantage of yourself.
Right. And it takes certain kind of listening to hear harmony and dissonance, even though nobody else can hear it. And you carry on going. I mean, like, you know, when people first heard Ornette, it said it didn't sound like music. Well,
of course. I mean, you know, I'm more conversant with, you know, Dolphy and understanding what they call Klangfarben melody.
Yeah.
You break up shards and you begin to move things where they turn into a certain form of harmony at another pitch of understanding.
Yes.
And this is what a musical establishment certainly, or any establishment, doesn't like, this kind of expansion of the mind. That Booker Little said, the late trumpeter said, the more you clash sound, the more it expands.
Yes.
So you want to expand this stuff, and it's stuff that you maybe personally is maybe difficult for you, but that's part of the process, the alchemy of hearing yourself.
Yeah. So for when I read you, I definitely get a sense of somebody who's speeding up the sounds and also, you know, forcing the sounds to, you know, to cross over into something else. a kind of new form of harmony, if you like, but not traditional forms of harmony. But there's other poets I know of who also really slow the time down.
Mm-hmm.
There's dub music, but also dub poetry, where you kind of you hear you can only hear the beat once it's gone through a kind of reverb or
Mm-hmm.
reverberation, and that's like. But some people who can't hear that
Mm-hmm.
resounding,
Mm-hmm.
it's just simply mechanical repetition. But it precisely in the reverb, time gets slowed down, and it creates a different kind of after effect, which again is opening up possibilities. Anyway, yeah, sorry, I'm
the open possibility, not the closed possibility.
Precisely. So tell me more about the Dolphy stuff. When did you start listening to Dolphy?
Well, at the same time I listened to Coltrane, to Dolphy through Train, and then I began to understand Dolphy as part of a matrix of sound that I was akin with. Mm-hmm. And over time, I was able to migrate to Dolphy's beginnings. Mm-hmm. Many years ago, I was able to meet Dolphy's parents.
Oh.
And I was able to, they were gracious people, and I met them at a point where all of this stuff had not gone into the public domain. Mm. I went to Dolphy's actual studio where she had never moved anything. And I noticed on his work desk, there was a book of Albert Einstein. And up above that work desk was a picture of Dolphy and Coleman Hawkins. Because Coleman Hawkins loved Dolphy and loved the new players. In other words, he was always attracted to open spirits that were opening, not trying to shut them down.
Yes.
So it's strenuous life because the grammar at that time was very violently reductive, even though this was a creative continuum. But he'd taken people like Ernie Henry and other people like that to begin to open his sound during that period. It's interesting stuff. And I was able to touch with Juno Lewis at that time.
Yeah.
And we talked about him taking Dolphy to USC to exhibit his work in 1957.
Yes.
And Chico Hamilton was aware of these things. And Chico went over to the folks' house and told them he would take good care of Eric. And that's when he took off after a belated period of practice to the East Coast.
Right.
Where everything began to open up for him.
Yeah. No, there's these geniuses. I mean, we're talking about, they're just like so inspiring and remain inspiring still, but they're difficult. They're difficult models to follow because they're kind of the way they saturate their materials and their forms is just like, it's just singular. It's really hard to.
It's not a commercial practice.
Yeah, you can't. It's hard to translate and it's hard to paraphrase and it's hard to do, and it remains hard to do now.
It is.
So tell me about. I was intrigued, and I know we're kind of coming towards the end here, but so I'll end with the preface, which is the kind of nice way to end at the beginning. So I'm not going to quote all of the preface. It's very short.
Yeah.
The preface to the new book.
Yeah.
Within my current terminology, you say, and you talk about what it means to be current. Within my current terminology, I understand the state of mind to be one of blazeless, blazing, not according to prior lingual aristocracy, which is a great phrase, but as attempted to impose a lingual theocracy of superimposed rationality. Do you want to say something about that?
These poems are like lingual nanograms.
Yeah.
A billionth of a gram. It's just the side of invisibility.
Right.
It can be measured and scripted, but I mean that the consciousness is to the level of that nanogram, that nanogram, because superimposed rationality tries to limit and contextualize language to such a degree that it begins to repeat itself and not square itself. so that it works with the limitless, or forms the limitless. So, you know, I just naturally am condensed at that understanding of being, linkable being, I should say.
Right. No, that's a great way to end. I gather we're still thinking about moving back to a Q&A with Eric if he's there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you both so much. What a fascinating conversation. I know all my fellow jazz fans out there are going to be super interested in the connections you've been exploring among so many other things, time, space, everything else. We do have a few questions, and let's get right into them. One, someone noting that the new book is dedicated to John Coltrane, and remembering the last poem in your book, Refractive Africa, dedicated to Jean-Joseph Rabare-Rivello, and wondering if you can compare those figures.
Interesting question. Rabare Rivello was like Adolphe of Madagascar in 1937. And he just couldn't get, unlike Dolphy, he wasn't able to get out of Madagascar. But Dolphy did get out of LA. And that was but he did understand his praxis. Both of them were conjoined by the sense that the praxis actually killed them. You know, Dolphy used to drink forms of honey. He was healthy, according to his fiancée Joyce, the great dancer Joyce Mordecai. But she said that Dolphy used to drink honey all the time for high energy playing, and she said he was always in good health until the honey just took over. But his mother told me that Eric didn't care if it killed him, if he was gonna. So he died from that kind of honey overload in his system. And as Jean-Joseph Rabare Rivello was linked to absolute colonial neglect, being festooned or sequestered in Madagascar. The officials wouldn't let him go to Paris, where he would have exploded. Always taught himself forms of, obviously, French and self-taught partial English. It is an amazing story. And he just couldn't take it any longer. And he just swallowed a dose of poison in 1937, excruciating, but he did. So that was, and he didn't know where he was going at that time, but he was just running around in mad circles like a rat squared away in a cage. And this is great poem, What Invisible Rat Comes from the Walls of Night, Gnaws at the Milky Cake of the Moon. He's talking about an experience in a gambling den. Beautifully put. But these are what things that poets go through. They're trying to avoid, not to avoid these things, but survive your own self. That's the thing, survive your own discipline. That's difficult. To get to this stage in life where one can reap the benefits of one's language. It takes a lot of stamina and silence and I would say courage, but other forms of erasure. It's like an animal in the bush that survives to a long age. he or it survives in a way that doesn't allow it to be eaten. I had to survive all of these not eaten stages, very, very similar, and it registers in your body that way too. You know, it creates all kind. Your numbers go up and down because of the circumstance, not because of basic non-health, but because of this poetry that's in you, that's working in an alchemical sense. So that's dangerous. That's dangerous to the medical profession, to yourself as part of the medical profession, as the human body. But you're just using your body as a template for language. And that's hard to convey to medical people or to just people in general, to librarians or bus drivers. That's what we're talking about here. That's what we're talking about, not just a specific area, but in general, you're talking about a general situation. That's what a poet goes against. It's an invisible kind of a current you're dealing with, you're going against.
Absolutely. Amazing. This might connect to the next question. Someone wanting to hear you expand on that phrase you used when you were talking about Pessoa earlier in the conversation, astral poets. Who are these forces? Can we access them? Are they among us on the everyday level?
No, they're not on the everyday level. One has to explore and work within oneself so that one creates a magnetic so that that energy can be drawn to your presence. In other words, one has to do self-work. And when people are always looking at the outside, bringing things into the tenor of the outside, but what about what's going on the inside that people in the United States or in the larger secular society don't understand? And I'm not talking about something religious, but I'm talking about something endemic to the spirit of one's being.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no superficial or general answer in that sense. How does one get this formula or that formula? It's not a recipe.
Right. Got to do the work.
Yeah.
And can you elaborate on your sense of alchemy's relationship to poetry?
It's practically the same, because alchemy takes one through the inertness and the velocity of, and then it morphs into the velocity of danger and intrigue and revelation.
Mm-hmm.
Lingual revelation, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the way that I think Michel Lelis put it, like, when the poet goes through trials, his or her reward is the great line that comes to one, the great poetic line that just naturally emerges from one's presence. So this is not a religious situation or a mechanical situation, but it comes through the work of one's presence in this experience that we call life on this earth. And
right.
One chooses to be a poet, not chooses to be a poet, but it chooses you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's why I made that analogy to Bud Powell. He said the piano chose me, and I was attracted, and we worked out that way. It didn't get into the way of life, because his was a difficult life, and poetry can be a difficult life. I guess Mr. Marriott would understand this endemically, and as you understand, reviewing all of these incredible works, but it doesn't come mechanically. You can't do it in an academy.
No.
You can't learn it just by some factory method that knows poets like Ezra Pound or Marinetti, people that are antithetical to one's reality. But one can take on poets like Shireel Anwar, although he had his deficits, or things like the great French poet that worked with René Demol, and I'll think of his name, Lecomte. Yeah, Gilbert Lecomte. But this is not an easy task. Not an easy task. And there comes to mind. Breton, a lot of people, or somebody like my friend Jane Cortez went through different. So it's all part of the mix.
Right. And I'm glad you mentioned Jane Cortez, because it kind of connects to this last question that I'll end on. This I actually got in person at an event we did last week, and we're talking about your event. Someone in the audience had been at the event. We were privileged to co-sponsor in 2000 here in Minneapolis, and they recalled how your physical presence, your poetry really flowed out of your physical presence, in certainly not in a performative way, but in a deeply somatic way. And it was just so I feel like in a way this connects to what you've been talking about, that the body's relationship to the evidencing of the poetry. What can you say just a little more about that?
Well, I've always thought about, not thought about it, but because I was at one point an athlete, and that energy, if poetry is kind of like an athletic activity, but in another kind of way. It's not competitive, it's not, but it has that kind of energy, that grace that you find in great, say, basketball players, going back to the old NBA to the present NBA. I had a chance to talk to one of the great players one day, Jerry West, and we were talking about the poetics of basketball. So it's not basketball, but it's a. And I was taking the conversation from the poetics of how language works. You can extract from everything how language works, because everything in life is language. So to be able to be athletically conversant with all these forms of understanding, like I'll sit down and read bits of astronomy or science in the morning, or something about alligators. Or there was this term, I think it was, this gentleman says, search for the strange for the sake of the strange. I'll remember his name in a minute, but all these things are acquired. It's like picking up particles along the way in life, and you begin to alchemically meld them into a whole circumference of energy.
Yeah. All part of that totality you were talking about striving for earlier. All your devoted readers out here, we're grateful and awed to see you keep reaching for that in book after book after book, and this new one, Divine Blue Light, no exception. Thank you both so much. David, thank you for leading this wonderful tour through Will's work. And to all our readers out there, thanks for being here. Don't forget, we have other great events coming up, some poetry, some prose. What can I say? Here at Rain Taxi, we like it all. And to all of you out there, thanks again. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Will.